as good practice towards a safe, secure and sustainable energy system. So the EI supports over 2,300 members, 23,000 members in fact, and there are also 250 member companies as well. And within the EI, we are the Young Professionals Network. So the YPN, we like to call it. This is a collective of networks that are regional and international that are led and managed by young professional members. So what they do is they engage in topical issues like COVID-19, as we're going to be discussing today. But also the core aim of the Young Professional Networks is to provide support in professional development and networking. And it's a fantastic network because it's sector-wide, it's across all parts of the energy spectrum, from oil and gas to renewables to sustainability, whether you're in a particularly technical role or in a commercial or legal role. The EI and the Young Professional Networks are a place for everyone that has a role in the energy industry or that is studying as well, to become highly engaged as well. So I will swiftly lead on to this event. So this is our first international event, which is really exciting for us. And it's great we've been able to use the advantage of technology to bring this for you. So this has been brought to you by the London YPN, the Nigeria YPN, and also the Malaysia and Middle East YPNs. And to kick off this discussion, we are going to ask you guys the title. So essentially, do you think COVID-19 presents a threat or an opportunity for the global climate agenda? And also your thoughts on achieving net zero in time for 2 degrees of global warming. So whilst you're clicking your answers to that poll, I will hand you over to Piotr from the Middle East branch, who will present our first speaker.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sinead. My name is Piotr Konopka. I'm a board member of the Energy Institute YPN in the Middle East, and it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. So Ms. Kate Dourian is a regional manager for Middle East and Gulf states at the World Energy Council. Previously, she worked as a program manager for MENA at the International Energy Agency, as well as a reporter and senior editor at Reuters. So before I hand it over to Kate, I just wanted to let all the attendees know that the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screens, is now open. So feel free, as you know, questions come up while our speakers are talking, to keep posting them. Some of them will be addressing straight after each speaker, and the remaining we will leave towards the end of the session. We're going to have at least a half an hour discussion. So Kate, over to you.
Thank you, Piotr. Hang on, what is going on here? Oh, do we have to vote? I've got a vote out there, a quick poll.
Yes, I think we're going to end polling now and then analyze it afterwards.
Well, good morning, good day, good evening to everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. I haven't got any slides, so I'm just going to speak. At the World Energy Council, we've been readapting the theme of our work around the theme of humanizing the energy transition. This was even before the COVID crisis. And what we're doing now is we're not sort of waiting to see what the post-COVID world is going to look like, but trying to make sense of the chaos to see the path forward. And, you know, do we move ahead? Do we pause and rewind? Do we fast forward? I mean, obviously there is going to be a huge change in behavior. I think that's going to linger for a while. And what we see now is the impact of human behavior. Now it's being forced upon us, the impact of human behavior on energy demand. Demand is down across the board. Demand for oil is lower than it has been since the Great Depression. The economy is moving into recession, the global economy, and but we are also seeing at the same time the positives of less pollution, cleaner rivers. So if you look at the energy mix as a whole, we're seeing decline in demand for oil. We're seeing decline in demand, slight decline for gas. coal has lost a lot, which is one of the reasons why we're seeing emissions fall. So what this means is that you have to take account of the social impact of an energy transition moving forward. So while we all have this ambition of access for all, we have to see how the current crisis, the financial impact of the crisis, is going to affect investment into the future. So what can we do now? Do we look at how this changing behavior has actually had an impact on climate change? Is it going to be moving ahead? Is it going to be policy driven? Because at the moment, most energy investments are policy driven. So do we work towards changing that policy as a community? Are we going to see more fragmentation? Are we going to see a more caring society? One of the things that I think, have seen is that the choices we make do matter. So we have often, in our scenarios, we've looked too much on the supply side shifts, but not so much on demand. And I think this has been an example of how demand side disruption can actually make a huge difference. So it makes engagement with the consumer is now more important than ever if we're going to move to a decarbonized future. And even if we take comfort in the fact that at the moment emissions are low, they would have to be sustained for a long time if we are going to achieve our targets. Now, everybody has these very, very ambitious targets, net zero. If we're going to, much of it depends on the shape of the recovery, when and how. Some people that we've surveyed at the moment in order to create our scenarios see a return within 12 to 18 months. So the majority think that there's going to be an impact beyond that time. So we are going to have to change the way that we behave. Are we going to take a plane? Are we going to drive a car? What kind of appliances are we going to use? Are we going to demand more energy efficiency from our appliances? Do we have to consider the rise of cyber risk because we've all gone digital as we are now? We're all making bread at the moment. I bet a lot of you are. Do we continue to make our own bread, or do we go to the bakery? And what mode of transport do we use? Do we use an electric vehicle? We've seen much of the reason for the decline in emissions is from the fact that in the electricity sector, we're seeing more renewables being deployed rather than coal, for example. Coal is being edged out. And we need to continue along that path. But the problem is it's going to rely so much on investment. Are we going to see investment being diverted to other more priority sectors? Health, for example, invest in resilience, invest in ensuring continuity of supply chains, which have been disrupted. Are we seeing a rise in nationalism? Are we seeing in some parts of the world, we're seeing vigilantes, going around forcing people to wear masks? But if we look at, there's going to be a dip, obviously, in economic growth, but the global economy was set to double in the next 20 years. So even if we get a dip now and we get a recovery, we still are going to need energy for humanity, which is one of our main themes. Now, when we asked, we have this survey every year, it's called the Issues Monitor, and we ask energy leaders what keeps them awake at night. Now, presumably at the moment, if they wake up, they find themselves in a fog. And what we need and we did something different. We asked customers, we said, would you be willing to change? Are you aware that your actions can actually help reduce emissions from energy? And most people didn't know that they would have an impact. And I think that's what we have to capitalize on at the moment. We have to capitalize on the fact that we have now consumer power and we can affect change. So I think we've become less passive than before, and we are the biggest shareholders on this planet, and yet we don't really have a voice in how energy is managed. And I think that's what we should all be aiming for going forward.
Thanks a lot, Kate, for your views. Thank you so much. I think, Maria, maybe you want to...
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, so if you switch over to the next slide. So thank you very, very much, Kate, for your inputs on the discussion. So up next is our UK speaker, which is Dr. Anastasiya Ostrovnaya. So yeah, before I introduce Anna, I just wanted to quickly touch on the London YPN. So yes, I'm part of the London Home Counties branch. However, we are today hoping to represent all of the UK active YPN branches, which are in the Northwest and North Wales, Aberdeen, Southwest and South Wales, Essex and East Anglia, Northeastern and Northern Ireland. So we do have all of those branches active in the UK as well if you don't live in the London area. So today we're delighted to have Anna on board with us. So she's a research fellow at the Centre for Climate Finance and Investment at Imperial College London and leads research projects on the financial markets, addressing several challenges posed by topics such as climate change. She has also worked at Deutsche Bank as a senior trader and has a PhD in financial economics from Carnegie Mellon University. So without any further ado, I will hand it over to Anna.
Thank you, Maria. I must give you credit for pronouncing my name because not many can handle that. And hello, everyone. It's a true privilege to be here and discussing this extremely exciting topic because it's absolutely critical moment at the moment, right? We're at this intersection and our future and future of our children and grandchildren will really depend on what path we take from here on. So can I have a next 2 slides forward, please? So as I've mentioned, as Maria mentioned, I work for the CCFI, Centre for Climate Finance and Investment at Imperial College London. And this center has been put together about 3 years ago, and we look at the challenges of climate change from the point of view of financial markets. And this is something which hasn't been done for too long, but it's a critical point because obviously climate change is by far and large is an investment challenge because we need to build new infrastructure, and for that we need investors. Next slide, please. So I'll just give a short kind of overview of what happened in the world, right? COVID-19 happened. Nobody expected that, and we talk about it at the very end. But the economic challenges and the challenges to climate change, next slide please, are not coming from the COVID-19 itself, but from the government's action to tackle this crisis, right? It originated in China, and China was the first to close the borders, followed by Asian countries, and then it scattered around the world, right? Now, almost 1/3 of the world population is under some form of a lockdown. I think it's according to some statistics, I didn't do counting myself, but it's it's either over 140 or 180 countries which implemented some measures. And in response to these measures, they also implemented some financial stimulus. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about 3 kind of main things which can change the direction which we travel. One is negative oil prices. What does it mean for climate transition? What does it mean for climate agenda? Macro-financial and fiscal stimulus, basically what governments do to support the population, what governments do to support the businesses, and so on and so forth. This really will matter of how we come out of this crisis. And third one is about renewables and how renewables are going to handle this crisis going forward and what are the implications of it. Next slide, please. So negative oil price, probably everybody's seen it in the news. What does it mean for energy transition? Well, I've seen quite a lot of people who are involved in renewables really overjoyed with low oil prices because oil companies are hurting and that's what they deserve because they don't do the right thing. I don't quite agree with this point. Low oil price generally, according to economic theory, has dual effect, right? So it's supply and demand. So low oil price incentivizes the consumption. Basically, if your gasoline is cheap at the pump, you're much more likely to drive, and you're much more likely to continue using combustion engine cars instead of buying electric. On the other hand, high oil prices usually incentivize innovation and energy efficiency. And that might not happen if the oil price is too low. So negative oil price or low oil price is really not equivalent to carbon tax. Carbon tax should be coming now because now we see what low oil price does to the producers. So why it's important what effect it has on the businesses and on energy transition here. On one hand, we will see change in the demand and consumer behavior. This is something which Kate talked about. But imagine how many consultants are not going to travel for the business meetings. How many meetings will take place on Zoom, like we're doing here right now, and so on and so forth. So it will change the behavior, right? How many people will actually choose to stay for a domestic holiday instead of foreign holidays? Well, given how the airline industry will recover, it's actually very likely it's going to be much more expensive to travel, right? On the other hand, you have a change in the investor behavior. And this is something which a lot of people overlook. I found this wonderful article on Reuters, which was dated in January this year, which quoting the pension funds in the UK saying, oh, if we did divest from oil, we would lose $600 million. I wonder what they're saying right now. They are taking this pain. Oil stocks were a cash cow for a lot of pension funds. So all the pension funds bled money through this crisis, through the low oil prices, because it hit the oil companies directly. In addition to that, there's already a bunch of non-performing oil industry, notoriously since 2015-16 low oil price times, took on a lot of leverage, a lot of debt, and there are already a lot of non-performing debt. On top of that, we have banks are one of the main financiers of the oil industry. If the oil industry is going to suffer, they will have to make those cuts. So this is very important to take to keep in mind, because this will affect, because we need still banks to participate in financing energy transition. We need investors to invest in the new infrastructure. We can't just scratch all of this out of the existence. Next slide, please. So the second point is what are the stimulus? So we already seen $5 trillion from just G20 in stimulus. And you see the percentages of GDP of how much money the countries are pumping back into their economies. Kate touched on that, the shape of the recovery. I would say not just the shape, but the color of the recovery really matters. Because how is the stimulus going to be implemented? Are we going to do it like we did it all the previous times and bail out the oil industry, which is a real big danger here? Next slide, please. So Trump actually said, and I wrote down his quote, he tweeted on 21st of April, to never let the great US oil and gas industry down. We are at real danger that the money in this hurry and emergency of COVID-19 situation will be just given out to the companies without anything, without asking anything in return. And this is the real danger, because we're already giving money, the government's already giving money to airlines without asking them for the plans to cut emissions. The money is being pumped into some oil producers. And if you want, there's this article on Guardian, which is kind of going over which polluting industry gets the money with no strings attached. And this is exactly where we can actually make a difference. If we don't just help the companies survive, but we help them survive and ask them to cut emissions. And this is very critical. And we as a society, the regulators and the governments and the central banks have to do this, have to start doing this. Next, please. And the third one is renewables. So there is this wonderful quote from IEA's Fatih Birol saying the plunge in demand for nearly all major fuels is staggering, especially for coal, oil, and gas. Only renewables are looking up during previously unheard of slump in electricity use. But what we've also seen is that electricity prices went negative in the majority of the European countries. And this is a real danger, and I'll explain why. Next slide, please. So now that renewables became so much cheaper and on par with the traditional forms of electricity generation, the subsidies started being removed from renewable generators. What often is overlooked is that subsidy very often packaged in a hedge, a market hedge, from the volatility of electricity price. So this is represented in these three graphs. So now a lot of renewables have to be built with no price stability in place. There is no market swaps to hedge electricity for 15 or 30 years. And without contract for differences or feed-in tariff, this is a real danger that the renewables would have to face this first graph of highly volatility and therefore be exposed to the negative prices. And especially if you remember that all wind usually locally is blowing at the same time and all sunshine is at the same time. Therefore, you have very negative correlation between production and prices for renewables. And this is something which cannot be solved by market forces without efficient storage. So what we need to do is we need to implement either hedge or some market stability mechanism. We did research, it's actually one of the research I led, and looked at what the cost of this would be. And we found that the cost of not having a hedge is between 2 and 3% higher. So if your electricity, your renewable asset had to generate 6% annual revenues before, now it would have to do 9%. Two slides, next slide, please. So here you see the distribution, and we actually just posted this paper on SSRN for those who are interested. And one last point that I want to leave you with is
Hello, Anna? Anna, can you hear me? I think you're on mute.
Hello?
Oh, there we go. Sorry, you were on mute for a few minutes. Oh, well, not really a few minutes, more like a few seconds.
Where did I cut off?
I'm not sure. I think you just started introducing this slide and you were leaving your last remarks.
Yeah, it's an important remark, so I'll repeat myself if it's okay. I want to leave you with a very important message, in my opinion. Risk management versus climate management. I teach risk management at Imperial, and I tell my students often that good risk management never gets to the newspaper headlines. We need to ask our question, how do we want to tackle the crisis with climate? Do we want it to be risk management or climate or crisis management? With COVID-19, we see how we mismanaged the risk, and therefore we're doing crisis management as a result. And this is, it's with COVID, with financial risks, and with climate, it's all alike. good risk management is very hard to recognize, because it's between nothing happens and therefore everything goes smooth, or you're tackling it so well that everything goes smooth. Bad risk management is very easy to spot. It's when unfortunate things happen. So this is something I want to leave you all with: crisis management or risk management. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Anna. I think that was really, really interesting, and we've got some new questions that have trickled in from that, so that's a great discussion. I'll now hand over to Kelvin, who will introduce our next speaker.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, good evening. Welcome once again. So my name is Kelvin. I'm with the Nigeria branch of the YPN. And I want to introduce the Nigeria speaker, Dr. Ibilola Amao. Dr. Ibilola Amao is the principal consultant of Lunade Global Services, which is a multi-award-winning women-owned ISO certified company. Dr. Amao is a fellow of the Energy Institute, a member of the Energy Institute Council, and she sits on the IP Week board. She's on the panel of judges for the Royal Academy of Engineering UK Africa Prize, and a member of the Nigerian Society of Engineers. So, Dr. Amao, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kelvin, and thank you so much to the YPN team who's put this together. Can I have the slides up, please? COVID-19, a threat or an opportunity. Next slide, please. In my opinion, I think it's a huge opportunity in spite of all the negatives that we have regarding loss of lives and the shutdowns and some of the issues around energy. This is a very good opportunity for young professionals. With the Energy Institute focused on knowledge, skills, and good practice, the new norm will operate within a digitized economy where there'll be less travel and more remote and virtual activities. So we cannot talk about COVID-19 without looking at the other parameters around the pandemic. The Sustainable Development Goals over the next 10 years, 2020 to 2030, is quite key around climate change and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We're also faced with low oil prices and excess crude oil supply. So I would be looking at where the opportunities lie for young professionals and the ability for them to transition their professional and career aspirations within this new regime. In the area of materials and metallurgy, there's going to be a huge investment in this area, looking for the right materials for carbon storage, because the renewables from wind, solar, gas to power, hydro, geothermals, and biomass is likely tied to the quality of the storage that we have on the, to enhance the energy transition. Supply chain procurement, contracting, warehousing, and logistics is another area where I see huge opportunities. The supply of petroleum products at the moment is way ahead, way beyond the demand. And this is where a lot of ingenuity is going to have to come to play. In emerging economies, gas utilization, gas to power, fertilizers, LNG, CNG, LPG is where the investments are being put in by the government. So these are areas where I see career opportunities for young professionals, and the opportunities more than a threat, COVID-19 and the energy transition being more of an opportunity rather than a threat. Next slide, please. This is an opportunity to make a career change in response to an aggressive energy transition. It is also very an exciting time for limitless adventures in the energy value chain. I'm inspired by the entrepreneurship opportunities that will drive the emergence of STEMpreneurs and techpreneurs. And this is going to reposition yourself as a young professional for the new norm and begin to look at the jobs of the future. Taking a look at the offerings on the Energy Institute website, I see the Chartered Energy Manager and the Charter Environmentalist as huge opportunity areas where one could make a transition from the more technical career paths to a broader spectrum whereby one takes in geopolitics, the philosophy of energy transition, the kind of human resources required, the financing, legal, administrative issues, and begin to chart a leadership and entrepreneurship career path. The Energy Institute Young Professional Network provides opportunities for young professionals who are interested in an aggressive energy transition to begin to fashion out the most proactive way of contributing towards attaining sustainable development goals. This is a good time to become more active with the network. Empowerment is very critical. Taking responsibility. This is a good time to look at your curriculum vitae and your LinkedIn profile and engage with experienced EI members. This is also a good time to engage in studies, desktop studies, news tracking, Google alerts, role modeling, and fashioning one's career pathway. At this point in time, the Energy Institute offers conferences, webinars, workshops, seminars, and short courses. This is a good time to upskill yourself and begin to look at how best to reposition yourself for the careers of the future and the jobs of the future. There are a lot of physical meetings that have been postponed at the moment. People are getting more engaged in digital meetings through webinars. And this is a good time to upskill yourself in the area of digitization, because the digital networking platforms are widely available at this point in time to engage with EI members and get empowered. At this point in time, the jobs of the future would be focused on attainment or on the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, leveraging cleaner energy, working on climate change, and the various targets that have been set around the environment. Cloud computing, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, 3D printing, data analytics are areas that will greatly influence the energy mix that will be used in various locations and geopolitical spheres. There will be a lot of remote and virtual work ongoing simultaneously. Augmented reality, virtual reality, XR and MR will be deployed collaboratively, and global cooperation is highly required in the new dispensation. This is a good time to begin to work through the career competency maps, which are provided under all the categories of the Energy Institute memberships, or chartered engineers, incorporated engineers, engineering technologists, the chartered energy manager. Time to create value in terms of becoming a STEMpreneur or a techpreneur. And these are basically science, technology, engineering, and maths driven and technology-driven entrepreneurship opportunities where you're actually converting issues, challenges, and problems into opportunities and solutions. Rather than see the COVID pandemic and the issues around the zero carbon situation as a threat, I think this is a good time to re-strategize on your personal career and professional development and reposition yourself as a STEMpreneur, techpreneur to be able to ensure that the energy transition creates opportunities for you in your career and your professional development. On this note, I'd like to encourage young professionals to see this season as a time of adventure and a time of opportunities to reposition their careers. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your insights, Dr. Amao. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to ask our next speaker, Alan Wallace, who heads the Energy Institute's branch in Malaysia, to share with us some of his insights.
Thank you, and good evening from Malaysia. I'm representing the Energy Institute in Malaysia, where we also have a small but very passionate YPN, and it's growing nicely. So look forward to seeing how that progresses. Taking and building on what's been put forward by previous presenters, I wanted to further discuss how we take this whole mess forward. Now, you can see from my bio that with a 36-year career in oil and gas, you may think I'm inclined to be conventional energy. Well, let's see. First slide, please. Go back one. So the energy transition, is it a tipping or a tripping point? Well, globally, have we reached that point where the energy transition has tipped in favor of renewables? Or will conventional energy once again be relied upon as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic and governments seek to ramp up their economies? Next slide. Are we witnessing the turn of this tide? Current methane and CO2 emissions are at a historic low. In generations which have rarely seen blue skies above their homes, for example in New Delhi, can now see as far as the Himalayas, the likes of Shanghai, Hong Kong, Manila, Jakarta, and Bangkok. They're all smog-free for the first time in decades. So even in grim circumstances, COVID-19 offers examples of how a greener world might look and feel. Although many of us cannot experience the full impact due to be confined to our homes, we can see on television and read reports of reductions in emissions and slowdowns in the rate of global warming, at least for now. Our environment reflects us with clean, fresh air, while the re-emergence of wildlife on our doorstep is a direct result of the reduced impact of humans on their habitats. In fact, you may have seen the reverse effect, where some creatures are venturing into habitats normally monopolized by us humans. The digital revolution, as mentioned previously, has gone into overdrive during COVID-19, where virtual communications and remote surveillance has taken on new importance, whilst traditional infrastructure activities, transport systems, and commuting has all but ground to a halt. So, is this a snapshot of how the future is going to be from now on, or is it just a blip? Next slide. So are we now at the tipping point where renewables and green energy gain the upper hand? There's a consensus that methane and CO2 levels will rise again as economies resume, with the main contributors being industry, transportation, and power generation. The question is, will CO2 levels be higher or less in comparison post-COVID? And what actions should we be taking right now to manage this effectively? Advances in renewable technologies will require rapid progress on the back of this global crisis. We just need to look back in history and the Second World War to remind us of how in such dire situations, they can be a catalyst for technological progress. This will certainly ensure we continue the journey towards providing a sustainable and green environment, and more so where us, the consumers, actively demand it. In terms of global commitments, we have steadfast support amongst most governments who are actively backing renewables and sustainable futures, rather than activities linked to conventional energy sources. Yes, conventional energy will remain part of the energy mix for some years to come. However, as young professionals, you can also be the agents of change in terms of managing the energy transition towards renewables. So, has COVID-19 finally sealed the fate of big oil? Next slide, please. Are we now seeing the tripping point where big oil regains the momentum? Political agendas and economic policies in certain countries do favour conventional energy, where there are heavy reliance on raw material production, exports, or high levels of manufacturing which require readily available and cheap energy. And because oil and gas prices are at a historic low, it makes business sense to reinvest. Although this means more methane and CO2 emissions in the short to medium term, economies will more readily turn a blind eye in favour of bringing their economies back from the brink as quickly as possible. Existing infrastructure and distribution networks use tried and tested technologies will make that decision making easier in the face of higher cost renewable energy projects. But as we all know, history has a habit of repeating itself. So will this impact on the decision making? For oil and gas especially, governments will need to seriously consider the increasing frequency of boom-bust cycles, where cheap fuels today can be super expensive tomorrow, based on market sensitivities, forces, political spats, changes in governmental policies, and just the media at large. Employment demographics in oil and gas show that choices made by young professionals are of key importance, as you represent the voice of the future and can take this opportunity to trigger change, despite conventional energy still offering relatively good employment opportunities in its twilight years. Next slide. So if we're to be part of this energy transition, how is it all going to pan out? It's going to be slow and sure, or fast and furious? Will a slow and sure approach result in a more sustainable recovery, with policies gradually introduced to encourage low carbon futures? This would see a determined push for renewable energy, clean and well-utilised public transport and home energy efficiency programmes. Oil and gas companies may realise that their businesses are not as resilient and take this as a prompt to change their business models. They, and importantly their investors, may now be more willing to accept lower returns on investment in comparison to their conventional investments, which tended, by the way, to average out on the high side despite those boom-bust cycles. The reaction to COVID has been swift and shows that governments can act quickly when they need to, with speed, control, and the appropriate fiscal policies, with trillions of extra cash pumped into economies through public spending. So, is a similar fast and furious drive directed to what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls the deeper emergency of the environment, a demand we must make of our leaders and policymakers? Next slide. So what would I like you to take away from this session? Well, 2020 was destined to be a big year in the climate change debate. But as we know, this year's United Nations Climate Change Conference, also known as COP26, has been postponed. Rest assured, COVID-19's impact will be top of the agenda, as well as progress made since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2016. For all of us who are stakeholders in the energy sector, it's more important than ever that we have our say. And through the Energy Institute, we all have a voice at the highest level and at the cutting edge of our chosen sector's journey through the energy transition. Now is the time to act. What we are witnessing is an unprecedented global crisis. And with this comes an openness for new ideas, innovation, and a call for action. So once things are back to normal, if ever, it will be much more difficult to make the changes. So how can you, as young energy professionals of the future, engage? Firstly, you must share your thoughts on social media. Second, Engage with your families, friends, and colleagues, and debate these key issues that we've spoken about this evening. Raise your concerns and ideas with your organization's management team. We all need to be open-minded here, so across all levels. See this as an opportunity to make our future more sustainable. Propose solutions and technologies which before COVID-19 didn't find many listeners. Take this as an opportunity to shape your own careers. You have the chance to stand out amongst your peers by expressing your thoughts and initiating change. Companies will recognize your contribution and energy leadership. COVID-19 will change the future landscape. Therefore, it is in all of your hands to turn it into something positive for the planet and yourself. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Alan. Thank you for your insights and key takeaways. Thank you. For everyone on the webinar, now you'll be able to see a poll that will ask you the same question that we had asked you earlier, just to check if you still have the same views or if you've changed your minds after listening to our speakers. And in a few seconds after we're done with the poll, we'll open the floor for questions. So plug in any last minute questions that you may have.
Thanks, Sharta. So while you're all answering the poll questions, which we're going to come back to after the Q&A session and closing remarks, we've received a number of really, really good questions, which now we'll try to aggregate and direct at the speakers. I think the most prevalent one that we've seen is about renewables and the impact of COVID on the green economy. So maybe this will be a question for all the speakers, and maybe starting with Kate. Which sectors do you believe, or which types of renewable technologies require the most assistance? What do you think the impact on market competition is going to be? And also, very importantly, what is your view on the demand for cheap fuel sources today versus looking into the future for green and renewable energy and the climate agenda?
I think one of the things we have to remember is that we're going to need all energy sources in order to meet the demands of the future. Now, we can mitigate the impact of climate change through energy efficiency. So we can actually, in 20 years' time, we can maybe flatten the curve. I think, yes, renewables have become more competitive. There is a risk that we may see a decline in investment because, or in projects moving forward, the ones that aren't already in place on renewables, because don't forget, we're not going to go straight back to business. It's going to be a new normal. You need to move staff into sites. I think that's going to delay things a little bit, but it does raise the issue that we can't do away with oil and gas. We can't do away with nuclear. We have to have all energy sources. The problem is to decarbonize. Even gas is now getting a bad rap because of methane emissions. So I think we have to look at decarbonizing. We have to look at a circular economy as opposed to just focus on one source of energy. If you look at, for example, the EU's Green Deal to 2050, moving to net zero, we would have to sustain this decline in emissions, like if it's more than 5% of 2019 levels, and it has to be sustained over a long period of time. Now, it's also going to be a question of policy. Are we going to see, in the United States, you might see the oil companies being bailed out, but it's ultimately about the economy. It depends on economic growth. And if you have growth in the economy, which you're not going to see immediately, there's going to be a dip, and then we start gradually moving back, maybe in a U-shaped recovery, that's going to have an impact on your demand. Now, transportation is obviously down by 60%. Now, if you have a slight recovery, you're not going to get a full recovery because people's modes of mobility are going to change. So I think decarbonizing, carbon capture and storage, is going to be very important. You're going to have to look at the whole picture. You're going to have to build resilience in the system. You need storage. It has to be done at scale. It's got to be affordable. And if you have fiscal stimulus, it's going to be directed at other sectors of the economy. It's going to be very, very difficult to find the type of investment that is needed in order to build the infrastructure required. You still need to have your baseload. The power sector is decarbonized. You have to look at other sectors where you can decarbonize. Now, one of the speakers mentioned low oil prices and how they stimulate consumption. Now we're seeing that there's more SUV sales when oil prices are low than electric cars. So that's why I keep focusing on energy efficiency, because efficiency standards are going to have more of an impact on emissions in the transport sector than electric cars. And again, you know, who is producing, what type of energy are we using in order to produce these the batteries and the everything else that goes into production. A lot of it is oil-based. A lot of it comes from petrochemicals. You still need plastics. It's just a question of how you balance the societal needs with environmental impact. And I think we have to look at hydrogen. We have to look at all sources of energy, and that's where I think the future is. It's digitalization, avoiding fragmentation, and developing these new technologies at scale that are affordable. Hydrogen, whether it's green hydrogen or blue hydrogen, I think that's where the future is. Of course, that's going to add cost. You know, if you impose a carbon tax, if you're going to have to deploy new technologies in order to decarbonize at source, oil and gas production, which is possibly 15% of your global emissions, then that's going to add to your cost. And where is the investment going to come from? We've seen a lot of the oil companies are cutting their capexes by 25 to 30%. Are we going to be left with stranded assets? How do we use these assets in order to, for example, instead of transporting gas, transport hydrogen? So I think there's a lot that has to be taken into account, but we must not discriminate against one source of energy as opposed to another. Let's not forget there are more than 800 million people in Africa that still don't have, in the developing world, that don't have access to electricity or clean cooking. So I think we shouldn't leave anybody behind. So that's why we need to rethink our energy policies. And that's where I think societal, social behavior and our voice has to be heard. So it has to be taken into account as we reshape the energy sector in order to take advantage of the opportunity in this terrible crisis.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate. Moving on to Anna, could you maybe talk about it from the perspective of investors and specific investments in renewables? Do you believe that we have sufficient stability mechanisms? If not, what type of mechanisms are required? What would be a realistic hedge for renewables? Is it realistic to believe that one day renewables are not going to be as strongly affected by oil prices in the future as now?
So first, I want to second Kate in that we need a lot of technologies, all of them, right? Just wind or just solar is not going to make it. So we need the wide variety. Right now, 95% of our renewables come from wind and solar. We need much more. We need storage. We need all kinds of technologies. We need technologies which we haven't come up with yet to reach the energy transition. Right? It's not just, there's no one key magic pill for solving the climate transition. From the point of view of markets, so the good news that low oil price reduces the return in a new oil project, new oil exploration. Until now, it was around 20% return. Now it's on par with renewables. So now investors will have a dilemma whether they go with the now used to be very popular, used to be very cash-rich oil projects or renewables. And while before many just went for financial returns saying we cannot surpass this, it's like this pension funds I mentioned, we cannot surpass this financial returns because we have fiduciary duty to our end investors. Now the equation is much more even. So now there could be more inflow of investment into renewables, where not only they're getting not worse returns than oil, but they also do the good thing, and they're preparing for energy transition. So this is the benefit of the low oil price. Renewables are deflationary, right? Technically, it's very good for end consumers, because, you know, if we have more renewables, technically they suppress the price, because when the sun is shining, it's shining everywhere on all the solar panels, and we have plenty of power flowing. The problem with that is, right, until now, so energy systems evolved dramatically in the electricity system, evolved dramatically in the last several years, right? There was one paper which stated in the last 6 years it changed more than in the previous 60. So the price of electricity was mostly driven by fossil fuels, and still largely is driven by fossil fuels in our system. But the more renewables you add to the system, the more this situation, this dynamic changes, right? At some point, there's an inflection point where overabundance of renewable energy will suppress the prices, and it already happens quite a lot, into negative territory. And you cannot do anything without proper storage solutions. You cannot monetize it unless you gas fuel, you know. So this does require smart market mechanisms or government intervention. It's not the market itself. Look, most renewables are marginal zero cost generators. That is, once you build the solar, if the price is 1 cent per kilowatt, you still want to sell it, right? If the price is anywhere above zero, right? And a lot of generators who are on the government contracts at a fixed price will generate into the negative prices, suppressing prices even down. So it needs to be, the policy needs to be smart about it. We can't just leave it to the market market rules to kind of to sort it out itself. It's not going to, not without the storage anyway. So, and then you obviously need to, you know, your renewable solution is not going to be universal across the globe. Kate is absolutely right about that. There's so many people still deprived of the electricity around the world. But the question we need to ask ourselves is, what kind of electricity do we want to provide them with? Do we really want to build coal power plants in Africa right now when the whole world is trying to clean up? Or can they leapfrog it and go to decentralized electricity systems which are driven by renewable? I think this is a very important point.
Thank you very much, Anna. So moving on to Ibilola, we've had a number of questions about the future of renewables in Africa. For example, long-term, say 25 years from now, what percentage of Africa's energy mix do you predict to be renewables? And do you believe that Africa is prepared for such an energy transition? And if so, what do you think are the funding requirements? How can Africa raise required funds to stimulate that transition towards green energy sources?
Africa is strategically positioned in areas where solar could be rather cheap once we get the materials for storage right. Another issue that is being contended with is the remote locations and the cost of off-grid solutions. So decentralizing the energy supply in Africa is definitely the way to go. And Africa will definitely be leapfrogging as opposed to going through the Western world's route of energy transition it will be leapfrogging based on technology and the available materials within the various geographies. Coal is definitely it's not being considered in most African countries at the moment. Solar is one of the priority areas. Hydro, thermal, and wind is not very popular in Africa at the moment. Gas is a very cheap source of energy in terms of the availability of associated gas in the areas where there are oil and gas activities ongoing. So rather than flaring gas, tackling the environmental issues, gas utilization projects are coming on stream at the moment, and there's a lot of investment in pipelines, and gas to power solutions are currently ongoing. Post-COVID-19, with the current situation in Africa, it's very likely that we're going to see more investment in renewables and cleaner energy, and technology will definitely play a huge role in the balancing of that mix.
May I actually add on or challenge you on that? There's a warning sign there, though, with Africa, is there are a lot of countries which balance their budgets based on the oil price. Without sufficient oil price, they simply won't have enough capital to invest in the newer sources. And this is a very big danger. This is why I'm a big proponent of a smooth transition and gradual transition. What happened with COVID, we've seen an abrupt change, right? We do not want to transition like this with the climate. We want a gradual transition where countries can actually reposition their economies, diversify, and make appropriate investments to set for long ride. And then that's the only way we can actually guarantee transition to renewables.
With the cost, with most Africans living at less than $5, and in some cases less than $1 a day, what is applicable in the Western world is not applicable in these emerging economies. And there's no copy and paste solution that could be applied in these environments. At the end of the day, investors in the manufacturing industry and high energy demand sectors will have a totally different solution from the masses in the rural and remote areas. And that's why I need to emphasize the importance of every geography in Africa determining, based on their natural resources and the investment climate and the poverty level, this energy solution that works for them.
I agree.
Right. Thank you very much for these thoughts. Now a question to Alan, given your extensive experience in the big oil and gas companies. The question we've had is whether oil and gas companies are investigating more opportunities to repurpose their infrastructure and increase their own investment in new renewable energy technologies to become players in that sector. What's kind of your experience and thought on this topic?
So I mentioned the boom-bust cycles, and in the last couple of boom cycles, there was some significant investment in renewables, unconventionals and renewables. Now, what happened was that when the industry slumped, those areas of renewables tended to be, the budget was reduced in favor of core business. I think this is going to be a very different situation. In the very short term, of course, there'll be a demand for oil, not much good for the oil and gas companies right now because they don't take much of a profit with the low oil prices. But you will see, like before, history repeats itself. These oil prices are going to rise, and unless we can make some smooth adjustments, the oil price is going to rise and go most likely over the $100 mark again. And we swing the other way. So I do think that, but this is definitely the trigger, the prompt for the oil majors to start looking at how they can place themselves into the renewable sector. But I just wanted to add that for this to happen, we need to be aware of the fact that, as mentioned before, that renewables also have a significant, or can have a significant carbon footprint. And that's something that needs to be taken into account and managed properly.
Great. Thank you very much, Alan. So maybe switching gears a little bit and coming back to Kate, a question we've had was about how consumers should behave. In particular, how can consumers best exercise their consumer power, and what do you believe are the choices that people should be making right now?
I think, according to the IEA, that the growth in energy use by households was showing no signs of decelerating. It reached more than 3,000 terawatt hours in 2018, which is nearly 15% of global final electricity demand. Now, it's not so much of an issue when you look at the fact that we have been able to decarbonize our electricity sector. The issue is how you decarbonize other sectors. I mean, one of the things that came out of our survey of consumers in more than 50 countries is that, yes, they're willing to change their habits, but they want to have more labeling for appliances so that they can see, the carbon footprint. But at the same time, they want big television screens. They're not willing to give up certain luxuries. Now, whether there's a change in fact, we've all been depending a lot more on our television screens and our computers. I think mandatory performance standards, which are not really, again, according to the IEA, a lot of the appliances we use are unregulated. Buildings are a big part of emissions, even in countries like Singapore. I think it's about 40% of emissions. So we've seen a decline, obviously, because offices are closed. But what happens when we get back to normal? Don't we need to have tighter standards, efficiency standards? So that's not very difficult. I mean, energy efficiency is the easiest way of ensuring that our carbon footprint stays within limits so that we can cap energy use. So, indirect emissions from power generation buildings are responsible for 28% of global energy-related CO2 emissions in 2018. Now, we've seen a decline in our emissions compared to 2019. But again, if you look at the fall in demand for energy, it doesn't really match the decline in global in the anticipated decline in global economic growth. So I think these two are so related that we can't. I mean, that's why we've seen this collapse in oil prices, because there's too much supply, there's not enough demand, particularly from the transport sector, which has been badly hit. And it's not really going to come back to normal. The question that was raised earlier is that, yes, okay, we want more, we will continue to need consumer goods. Even in the energy transition, we are going to need supply and the supply chains. And a lot of it comes from China. China's building, or is planning to build, more than 120 new coal plants. Now, is this going to carry on despite their blue skies policy? So I think we need to look at a global reshaping of the energy complex and not just focus on one sector. I think electricity, it's easy to have renewables. Yes, they are competitive with gas without subsidies. But what about the countries where you have had a sort of renewable interest in renewables? If you look at the GCC, I mean, I'm down as being in the UAE, which I'm not. I'm actually now in the UK, but having lived in the UAE for a long time, there was a culture of waste because prices were subsidized. I mean, subsidies are being slowly eased, but is this going to continue, or with prices so low, it's easy to remove subsidies because they're affordable. And there aren't that many, the taxes are not very high, but if you look at renewables deployment, you have sunshine in the Gulf region, but renewables amount to only about 1% of the power generation capacity. And most of it is concentrated in the UAE. Now we see these huge, so I think we're starting from such a low base. And the question now is there going to be enough funding for investment in renewables? Are the energy companies, like we've seen Shell and BP now have net zero targets, but not so much the likes of Exxon. But it really is going to be very much up to the banks. Are we going to see Wall Street still continuing to invest, to lend money to shale producers? I think we're going to see a total shift in investment flows. And for a young person looking in, I think it's digitalization. I think it's more looking at innovation. And there's a risk now with the fiscal tightness that research and development will suffer. And that would be, catastrophic, because you really, really need to have a lot of funding in research and development in order to shape a new energy future.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate. We had a question for Anna on the stimulus packages, particularly how the large debt from COVID-19 related stimulus packages will interact with what Alan called tripping points, meaning a potential regain and growth of fossil fuel industries, which are low cost in the short term. The question is it likely that governments will be able to afford the long-term approach that climate change and growth in renewables requires? So maybe I'll ask for very short 1-minute answers from Anna and Alan before we move on to closing remarks, please.
Difficult but important question. Well, governments are taking unprecedented amounts of debt. Obviously, that will impact and how they spend it. In my little presentation, I did talk about the stimulus and how it allocates. And obviously, EU is one of the leaders in thinking of green stimulus, right? But we still haven't seen it being affected. And we've seen airlines being bailed out, and oil companies are getting some help as well, without any conditions put on it. Governments will increase the debt. That will pose next set of restrictions of how they can transition, right? Right now, they're doing it because the situation is urgent, and often without too much of a long-term thinking, but that needs to change.
From my side, IOCs, they tend to have very much of a focus on their investors, with one eye on the pension funds. And then you have government-owned national oil companies who will be required to generate much more income to help manage the deficits that their governments have attracted because of the coronavirus. That's my view.
All right. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are slowly running out of time. So before we move on to closing remarks, I just wanted to share the results from the polls. So what you should be seeing on your screen right now are the results from the polls that from the first poll at the beginning of this session. So whether COVID-19 is a threat or opportunity for the global climate agenda, majority consider that actually an opportunity, 80% of the answers. And then for the second question, do you believe the world will reach net zero emissions in time to meet the goal of 2 degrees global warming over the century? Majority of the answers, however, not such a huge majority, said no. We seem to have a lot of optimists as well amongst attendees, which is good to see. So 60-40 split between no and yes. And then in regards to the poll that we did straight after the session, it seemed like the percentage amount of people who consider COVID-19 an opportunity grew a little bit, but also the number of people who voted increased. So a small uptick, but still similar views. So with that, I would just like to give the floor again back to each of the speakers, maybe to comment on these results, but more importantly, if we could ask you to just give 1 or maximum 2-minute closing remarks, and the question that we would like to pose to you, representing the global network of young professionals working in the energy industry, is where do you believe the biggest opportunity for young professionals currently lie? If you were to start your career over again in this crisis, what sort of areas would you focus on? And where do you think the future of the energy industry now lies? So let's go in the same order. If we can start with Kate.
Yes, I think it's interesting that people don't see that the majority don't see that we are going to achieve our climate targets, and I think this is probably the time to sort of pause and think. We have come together as a global community. I think we're reaching out to people and family members. I think we've realized the importance of human contact, and that is not something that we're going to be able to forget. So I think that we need to now sort of come together as a global community and build a sustainable future. And I think we've the COVID crisis, I think, has made all of us realize our own mortality. And let's not forget that this is a disease that is a respiratory disease that hits your lungs, and the air that you breathe matters. And I think that is going to be one of the most important lessons that we've learned, is that our behavior, yes, it was forced upon us. It is not something that we chose to do, but maybe in the future, we need to choose to do that. And I think the young population, when I first joined the IEA, I was asked, what did I think the IEA wasn't doing enough? And that was a while ago. And I said, I didn't think they were doing enough on the environmental aspects of energy. And I think since then, a lot has changed at the IEA. And I said, because I want to build a better future for my child. I am a mother at the end of the day. We are all parents, we're sisters, brothers. And I think that's probably the most important lesson we've learned. So for the youth of today, you are going to build the next energy system. You are the ones who are going to be, when I talk to older people, I say, oh, did you watch the webinar? I say, oh, I'm too old to sort of, deal with this newfangled digital stuff. You are the digital age. And I think if we build resilience as a community, we can actually work through an energy transition that does keep the air clean. It doesn't mean that we don't use all types of energy. We just have to find ways of making it cleaner. And I think that's where young people come in, because you want a planet that is healthy enough for you and your generations to come to live in. So I think that's the important lesson. I think we can do it, but we have to stick together as a community.
Thank you, Kate. Moving on to Anna.
Thank you, Kate. Really, really good, actually, summary. And I think not just the community, not local community, but the global community. And like COVID, it requires global cooperation. Climate change is the challenge of our generation. And because of the time and delay effect, the people who are responsible for climate change are not the ones who will have to deal with the consequences. So it's the young people. And as much as for those who dialed in, like, I can't imagine any person who dialed in today would want to go to promote coal industry today. Coal industry is not dying because of Trump. It's not going to survive because of Trump wants to support it, but because the market forces and regulations and people's preferences squeezing it in. So you can use this as an example and see what world we want to live in, and what regulation and government action and investors action we are anticipating in the future. And you want to position yourself for the future, right? Like you wouldn't want to go into work for a coal company. What do you want to do? So this would be kind of my message, is to look forward.
Thank you very much, Anna. Dr. Amao?
My closing remarks are that energy environmentalists and energy managers have a more exciting future ahead of them, because this is a global solution. I see opportunities for STEMpreneurs and techpreneurs, so they need to have the mind of an entrepreneur, even at their jobs. Green chip funds must be encouraged as a stimulus to accelerating a transition to cleaner energy. And the Energy Institute should drive this change, with our young professionals doing as much as possible to make this change happen. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And last but not least, Alan.
Yeah, so in closing, obviously, as I said at the start, my whole career has been in oil and gas, and it's given me a very good career. But I do realize that for the next generation, renewables is definitely the way to go if we're to achieve our targets. But just with a caveat, and that is that we need to be aware, as I said in my last point, that there's a certain percentage of carbon footprint associated with renewable energy. And I'm not getting paid for this, by the way, but if you like to have a look at Planet of the Humans on YouTube, it's an excellent YouTube documentary on the climate change and renewable energy versus conventional energy.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. So this is a great leeway into an initiative that's currently being pursued by the Energy Institute called Generation 2050, which Maria will talk about next before we close off the session. Please go ahead, Maria.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you so much to our speakers for this discussion and for everyone getting involved with your questions. I think this has been a really, really interesting topic of debate. Yes, so this is a really good leeway into Generation 2050, which is a project that the Energy Institute is undertaking. I just wanted to quickly speak on the high level of what this project will be, as it's still in the works, but essentially Generation 2050 is all about reaching out to us young professionals who will be the energy leaders of the future in 2050, at the time when we will need to see the changes that we are working so hard to get to now, and forming a pathway for our voices to be heard by the industry's current energy leaders in this day and age, who will have the biggest impact on what our world will look like in 2050. So yeah, Generation 2050 is all about having our voices heard as young professionals. So please stay tuned for that project to go live from the Energy Institute. So what we have so far is that it will start off with a kickoff survey, and then we'll include some other ideas, such as including some of these survey participants in our podcast called Energy in Conversation. And then, well, it was originally designed to have COP26 as an ultimate goal to carry these thoughts gathered from the survey to COP26, but obviously given the current situation, we're still working around this, but we're aiming to gather as many opinions as possible and eventually report to industry, have these voices heard by the people that matter, and of course engaging with social media, which is to this day an extremely powerful tool, as we're seeing with increased digitalization everywhere. So please stay tuned for this project.
Great. Thank you very much, Maria. I think that's all that we've had planned for today. So again, thank you very much for the speakers for a fascinating discussion. Thank you to everyone for attending and for the great questions that you've been sending to us. If your question hasn't been answered, we will do our best to address them in some sort of a publication, which we are planning to write and publish in the coming weeks from this webinar. Please do follow the Energy Institute website for the future events and webinars. Following this, we'll also be sending to everyone just a very quick survey on SurveyMonkey to gather your feedback on this event and capture your thoughts on what sort of future events we should be running for your benefit. And with that, we'll close. Thank you very much. Stay safe and speak to you soon.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Amao.
Very welcome.